Eddie's secret recipe worked. He kept it simple. Dial in the tone until it feels right. Don't get caught up in all the modes. Surround yourself with the best, and just play the living hell out of that guitar.
Subscribe. Thank you.
Fresh off the release of a successful debut album, Van Halen hit the road in '78. They opened for Journey, Montrose, and Black Sabbath. During the European leg alone, they did 23 shows in 25 days. Eddie was a huge fan of Tony Iommi, and because of this tour, he finally got to meet him. David Lee Roth called the tour a real shot in the ass, and at this point in time, he pretty much lived off of his breakfast of champions, Snickers bars and Coca-Cola. Members of Van Halen marveled at the fact that Ozzy and Bill Ward would just go and hang out drinking with other members of the crowd before the show on the front lawn. Eddie was pleasantly surprised that the guys in Sabbath weren't all high and mighty acting like stars, but just a few chill guys. Ozzy had done a tour with Kiss, and he joked that it just about killed him because Kiss were just so damn good. So he said, let's not do that again. Let's just get a bar band from LA. Ozzy said that backfired because Van Halen were also just that freaking good. Ozzy was also surprised that they were opening at the Rainbow Club supporting Sabbath, and once that first record broke, they were headlining. Ozzy had said that Van Halen should have headlined the entire North American leg of the tour. One highlight of the first tour was when Van Halen pulled the parachute stunt. It was one of Roth's crazy promo stunt ideas. They basically stole the show from Sammy Hagar, who would end up singing for them years later. They made a grand entrance to the Anaheim Stadium show in September of '78 by having 4 lookalikes jump out of a plane high above the venue right at the end of Sammy's set. The members of Van Halen were waiting in a van right outside of the venue, and the stunt doubles landed nearby before a completely shocked, sold-out audience. The jumpers entered the van, and then the real Van Halen came out wearing the same outfits and ran on stage. So many people thought it was actually Van Halen jumping out of that plane. It turned out to be an excellent PR stunt. Van Halen's next album, Van Halen 2, was recorded in just over a week. The label didn't give them that much of a budget to record it, despite the success of the first record. The studio heads deemed it a failure. After rolling off their grueling first tour, Van Halen was a well-oiled machine, and because of that, a good chunk of the album was done in first takes. They brought along Ted Templeman and Don Landy, who employed the same mindset to laying down the tracks, minimal overdubs, and the sound was more raw and less drenched in reverb than their first effort. Eddie was all about cranking his amps to as high as they could possibly go, overdriving the circuits. Between the Variac and the mid-bumped EQ boost in the front, he had a sound and feel, making his guitar play just like butter. Eddie had a new axe as well. His famous frankenstrat was being copied by everybody, so he built a new guitar. This one, called the Bumblebee, had a yellow and black striped paint job. Made through Charvel, where the electronics were actually loaded in the back so it had no pickguard. He really liked the Boogie Body's maple neck, so he swapped that one out with the neck that Charvel had originally put on. He then gutted the guitar, putting in a DiMarzio Super Distortion humbucker. This guitar had only one cavity for the bridge pickup. He even got down deep and hot-rodded the pickup, swapping out the original magnets for Alnico from a Gibson PAF humbucker. He then rewound the pickup by hand, and then dipped it in paraffin wax, putting copper tape on the windings. He got rid of the gold knob that Charvel provided, and in place he just put an old-school Fender Strat tone knob cover. He finished it up by swapping out the original Charvel Strat-style bridge for a Floyd Rose. This one can be heard throughout Van Halen 2. Ted Templeman had actually dialed back the guitar a little bit in the mix, so it's not quite as bright and out there as it was in the first album, but it still sits in there pretty nicely. The Bumblebee guitar would end up being buried with Dimebag Darrell, who was tragically killed on stage during a Damageplan concert. Dime was a huge Eddie fan, and they both had a mutual respect for one another. The studio heads turned out to be completely wrong, and the album did great, hitting gold a month later and platinum in May of '79. Interestingly, Eddie was already talking about experimenting with synthesizers, but that had never came to fruition. It wouldn't be until the next album that listeners started getting treated to Eddie's keyboard wizardry, albeit in little bits. And the album started it out with You're No Good, which was originally a hit performed by Betty Everett in 1957. and a bigger hit by Linda Ronstadt in '74. Van Halen's arrangement is slightly reminiscent to Running with the Devil. Their take has the Van Halen signature all over it. Michael added some killer harmonies and tasty flanged higher octave bass licks at the top, with some nice volume swells by Eddie in the beginning. Then the band kicks in, smoldering and subdued, building up to that chorus. It was at that point Roth totally sold this one when he hits those wailing high notes. The song probably would have done better had they continued on morphing Ronstadt's arrangement. Listening to the original Linda Ronstadt version, the best part was always the end. And it would have been interesting to hear them do something similar in the way they ended Drop Dead Legs, or even during that slamming solo section in Summer Nights later on. Instead, they pretty much stuck mainly to the verses and the choruses. A lot of people say it's a curious opener, but it's one that probably was chosen because it sounded a little bit like Running with the Devil. Somebody Get Me a Doctor would have been a much stronger opener, an absolute smack you upside the head guitar riff with a chorus that completely sticks in your head. The band was completely on fire on this one, and it features one of Eddie's best solos. In a way, this album was kind of a precursor to what they ended up doing later in Fair Warning. Some songs just had absolutely infectious riffs. DOA, Out of Love Again, that one had a completely aggressive groove. Eddie really got into the swing of things with Beautiful Girls, and they threw down a really nice tight groove. The chorus could be seen as a bit kitschy, but again, it is Van Halen, and they were a California party band. Definitely something in it for everybody, though. And then the song Dance the Night Away is highly polarizing. It turned out to be the most radio-friendly song on the album. Not really danceable. Fans either loved it or couldn't stand it. It's very catchy and very happy, but somehow just an odd fit on any Van Halen album, though it probably would have fit better on Diver Down later on. Nevertheless, it does stand as one of their classics. For Spanish Fly, Eddie was finally able to show the world just how versatile of a player he was. Recorded simply on a mic'd-up nylon string guitar, Eddie let it rip. So many cool three-note sequences, semi-legato speed-picked runs and tapping licks, but he showed his flamenco side, speed-picking the high E string while simultaneously playing a little minor line on the low E string. Eddie's classical influence really shined through in this one, and it's every bit as strong as Eruption in its own way. The album cover has a pretty interesting story to it as well. David Lee Roth was doing one of his famous jumps to be captured on the photos for the back. He came down hard on his foot and ended up breaking it. So there's a shot of him with a wrapped up foot posing for the camera. The big takeaway for Eddie's playing on this album is that he had mastered the art of harmonics, and they found their way into his solos tastefully throughout the album. The intro to Women in Love is a masterclass in playing harmonics in and of itself. His playing had gone to another dimension, and it really showed on Van Halen too. And Van Halen's evolution didn't stop. They kicked out what many considered to be the quintessential DLR-era Van Halen album, Women and Children First, in 1980. Coming off of Van Halen 2, Eddie has not been happy with the sound, so he went back to pretty much the same rig they used on the first album. He also ended up adding an ADA preamp booster in front of the head with an extra smack of gain on the front end. Right from the get-go, Eddie Van Halen broke out the flanger to start the album. The first in a line of timeless Van Halen classics, and The Cradle Will Rock included Eddie's keyboards in addition to his fiery guitar work. Everybody Wants Some, Roth's obvious statement echoing the hormonal mindset of every awkward teenage stoner within listening distance, and Fools, which carries on the tradition of letting Eddie completely rip at the top of it. His rapid-fire triplets, later to be echoed in Nuno Bettencourt style a few years later, were the perfect way to kick off the first swinging track. Romeo Delight is fast-paced and hard-rocking. It translates as high energy perfectly to the stage. Eddie's solo in this one is completely off the charts. Full-on MXR phase blazing pentatonics, and a few symmetrical fretted licks thrown in for good measure. Take Your Whiskey Home starts out with some down-home, dirty bluesy acoustic played by Eddie, Roth's lyrical swagger over the top, and the band goes into full-blown mode from there on out. Take Your Whiskey Home didn't quite live up to what it could have been, because when the band kicked in, it didn't quite have that groove and swing of the acoustic intro. Nevertheless, this tracks beautifully on the album. Then there was a world invasion tour that followed. Namely, a standout occasion was at the Riverfront Coliseum in Cincinnati. At the same venue, 11 months before, 11 people had been trampled to death during a concert by The Who. So the venue had completely clamped down, having a no-tolerance policy on drugs and alcohol and pretty much anything else other than standing and cheering. So on April 24th, when Van Halen played, 177 people ended up getting arrested, mostly on alcohol and drug charges, and they also busted 100 people for smoking due to the open flame restriction. David Lee Roth himself was also charged with complicity to violate the fire code. He kept urging the crowd to flick their Bic, a term from the old commercials for the Bic lighter. Nothing ever really came of it though, and Van Halen were off to Chicago to play another show. Many die-hard early Roth-era fans were of the mindset that the next album was the last great album that Van Halen made, and probably the greatest one they ever made, Fair Warning. Right when it starts, Eddie goes into this nearly impossible tapping and slapping with harmonics, highly rhythmic. This turned out to be the perfect way to start an album. Then Eddie goes into it, that riff, and when the band locks in, you know it is on. Mean Street sounds just like its name, hardened, grimy, and out-and-out dangerous.
Breaking this routine, talking some new kid, one like you ain't never seen.
There's always been this innate heaviness and intensity about Van Halen, but in this tune, they got rid of the California party band vibe altogether and got completely serious. And that was just the opener. The track Dirty Movies features Eddie's slide playing, where he had a really cool counter melody to the main chorus. Roth's calls to take it off reflected the full-on hedonism depicted throughout the album. Eddie employed a tasty slow-flanged intro for Hear About It Later. With its smoldering solo breakdown and Alex's cowbell-driven groove, it's no wonder this type of breakdown would re-emerge on songs throughout the rest of their career. Unchained turned out to be overall the most popular song on the album, and it definitely delivered. Van Halen, true to form, played it heavy, with Roth's bantering antics on full display as he was busting Ted's chops after the solo section. Ted ultimately responding, "Come on, Dave, give me a break." Eddie was really making good use of the flanger by this time, and he went full-on fusion soloing over the sultry Push Comes to Shove, some of his best guitar work ever. On So This Is Love, the band went into full swing mode, and we got a good sampling of some evil keyboard work by Eddie on both Sunday Afternoon in the Park and One Foot Out the Door. But the album recording wasn't without its setbacks and drama. Eddie had just gotten married to Valerie Bertinelli in December of 1980, so he had a lot going on. Valerie was starring on the popular sitcom One Day at a Time.
Why don't you just ask Super Cooper here, the star of Senior Problems?
Their marriage was big news back in the day, being covered at length in everything from guitar magazines to the tabloids. Eddie's life had just become a lot less private, and the drugs and alcohol were starting to take their toll as well. The band were starting to experience internal struggles, where Eddie was trying to push the band in a particular direction but met resistance at each turn. They couldn't rely on stuff written during their club days. Everything was written in the studio, and it was easy to pick up on the aggressive vibe that was in the air during that time. Eddie got so pissed off at Ted Templeman at one point that he was about to leave the band, but got talked out of it by his brother Alex. The album also didn't sell as well as their previous efforts, at least initially. It was panned by critics, but at the same time its legacy matured to the point that it is heralded as one of rock's most important albums of all time. Many likened it to Led Zeppelin's Presence, because they were both indicative of a tough time the band was going through, but it was that pain that made them such great yet overlooked works. The next album, Diver Down, was recorded over 12 days at Amigo Studios in 1982. They were originally going to do just a couple singles, but the record label said, "Hey, where's our album?" They only wanted to do a couple songs just to keep them out there. This turned out to be Eddie's least favorite album because it was so heavy with cover songs. This was both at the insistence of the label and David Lee Roth. They covered the Kinks as Where Have All the Good Times Gone, and it served as a fairly decent opener. And it definitely wasn't without its hits. Oh Pretty Woman, a Roy Orbison cover, turned out to be one of their most influential works, with even Paul Gilbert's band Mr. Big taking the entire main riff and turning it backwards for their song called Wind Me Up. Dancing in the Streets featured some cool synth work by Eddie, and all those famous Van Halen harmonies were on full display during the choruses. Eddie's standout piece on this one, called Cathedral, had him using a combination of volume swells and perfectly timed dotted eighth note delay. This is a technique that has since found its way into the lexicon of most sought-after guitar techniques. Alex's dad joined them playing the clarinet on Big Bad Bill is Sweet William Now. For this track, the band got into full-on gypsy jazz meets Dixieland, a total departure and a sign of where David Lee Roth would head musically later on. Intruder has a pretty interesting story. Apparently the video they had made for Oh Pretty Woman was about 3 minutes too long, so that is actually David Lee Roth messing around on a synthesizer. They tacked it on at the beginning, and it also made the album cut. For the song Little Guitars, Eddie tried to emulate Spanish flamenco guitarist Carlos Montoya. Eddie's right-hand fingers just weren't doing it, so he had to also use a pick to augment some of the notes. And Roth, not knowing the difference between Spanish and Mexican, made the lyrics more Mexican in nature to complement the song. It was called Little Guitars, named after the mini Les Paul Eddie had brought in from a luthier during the Fair Warning tour. And of course, they have their burning tracks too. Hang 'Em High is one of early Van Halen's most intense and hard rock and fast-paced tunes, originally called Last Night. Roth wrote different lyrics for it, but otherwise it stayed fully intact from the original version in '76. Equally impressive is the song The Full Bug, almost like a mix of Ice Cream Man and I'm the One, taking some really good elements of both. It's an all-out hard swinging tune that pulls out all the stops. To close it out, they went a cappella for Happy Trails. This one's a really good display of how the band harmonizes together. And it also shows that rich, full voice that only David Lee Roth himself could pull off. The album did really well. They weren't under such pressure to have to come up with material in the studio the way they did with Fair Warning. Critics loved it for the most part. Eddie didn't, but the album did get their name further out there. Around this time, Eddie Van Halen thought that he was being prank called. The guy on the other end of the line was none other than Quincy Jones, asking if he could come in and lay down some guitar on a new Michael Jackson tune. Jackson already had a couple songs in the bag, including Wanna Be Starting Something and Thriller. Jones wanted him to have that quintessential rock tune, so Michael put together his own spin on a rock tune, Beat It. Steve Lukather had already played a lot of parts as a session player on the album. Steve was friends with Eddie and suggested him to Quincy to be the ringer to come in to lay down the lead part. Quincy Jones ended up calling Eddie 4 times and was hung up on each time, with at least one of those times consisting Eddie telling him to fuck off, thinking it was a prank call. Quincy finally was able to break through and say, "Hey Eddie, I want you to play on Michael Jackson's new record." Eddie was definitely skeptical at first, but agreed to do it. But he didn't want the band to know that he did it, so he asked for no credit. Anybody out there who has any idea of how Eddie Van Halen played would know that he would never get away with that, especially considering how big of a hit Beat It would become. Eddie asked Quincy what he wanted him to do, and Quincy said, "Whatever you want." Eddie cautioned Quincy that he might want to be careful there. So Eddie Van Halen kept trying to solo over the breakdown, the part with the knocking on the studio door that made it into the mix, but it just wasn't working out. According to Eddie, it was so one-dimensional it didn't give him enough to work on to come up with a decent solo. So he tried over the verse and then everything clicked. So Eddie actually did a little rearranging. He had Don Landis splice the tape all over the place so the song could be rearranged in a way where he felt his solo would fit. Eddie thought that either Michael Jackson is going to like this thing or he's going to have his bodyguards throw him out on his ass. When Michael heard it, he gave it the go-ahead. As a matter of fact, Michael was so appreciative that Eddie would actually take the time to do that, showing he wasn't just there to lay down a guitar solo, but he actually cared about the song. The main thing, according to Michael, was that he wanted to hear that high fiddly stuff that Eddie was so well known for. Eddie didn't get a single penny, and he even brought his own beer to the sessions, turning down Quincy's beer offering. But when it hit the radio, it was David Lee Roth who discovered it. He had said he was out in a parking lot in Santa Monica at a 7-Eleven, and a couple ladies had the door open on their truck, cranking it up. David thought this solo sounded awfully familiar, and that maybe somebody was trying to cop Eddie's licks. He was immediately ticked off, as would the rest of the band, when it came to be known that it was actually Eddie playing it without having discussed it with them beforehand. They had made a pact. Anything done externally would require a mutual agreement in the band. They were also extremely pissed off that Eddie Van Halen was getting all the limelight and none of the cash. Worst of all, the album that Beat It would be on would end up keeping Van Halen's next album from hitting #1, adding insult to injury. By '83, Eddie was building a new studio called 5150 right on the property he lived at with Valerie Bertinelli. It was named after a law code in California for temporary involuntary commitment of people who were considered a danger to themselves or others. Don Landy assisted in the building of it and heard the police code 5150 over a police scanner. And so after mentioning it to Eddie, the name stuck. Of course, Eddie had to get it past zoning, which was pretty strict in California. So he told city inspectors that he was building a racquetball court. The inspectors were a little confused when they checked it out, wondering why there was so much insulation with fiberglass and rubber on the walls. Eddie told them that the racquetball could get pretty loud, so he didn't want to disturb the neighbors. How they fell for it, one would never know. This is Eddie Van Halen we were talking about. There's a huge, powerful antenna that broadcasted on AM a couple miles away. Since they were using wireless guitars and mics in the studios, they didn't want to get interference in the form of boxing matches and football games, so they had some engineers come over and wrap the entire place in chicken wire fencing, essentially creating a Faraday cage to keep the interference out. It was a big room, basically a sound stage that had some really good reverberation. While they were getting it together, Eddie Van Halen was messing around with synthesizers and ended up composing some songs that would end up on the upcoming album. Eddie had said that he felt a lot more freedom without pressure to do anything in particular from Ted or David Lee Roth. The band got together in '83 and recorded the last album to feature their original lineup, 1984. It was also the first album to be recorded in Eddie Van Halen's 5150 studios. Eddie had already put together some ideas on the synthesizer, so the band had to strike up a compromise where the album would be part keyboard-driven tunes and part four-piece guitar-driven songs. Their smash hit Jump was written on a Sequential Circuits Prophet 10 keyboard in Eddie's bedroom during the time the studio was being built. The keyboard part had almost a light Christmas song feel to it. Very catchy, very simple, but the song didn't have any kind of heaviness until Alex started smashing the kick and the cymbals. Once the band fully launched in, it became obvious that Van Halen was making a whole brand new kind of statement. It was quintessential 80s all the way, with their chorus and a gang vocal all yelling. This was as pop as the band could get, but not in a shameful sense. The album had a sheen to it, as did Eddie's guitar tone. Top Jimmy, a song that's near and dear to this narrator's heart for some odd reason, featured Eddie playing a fully stereo guitar, and it's pure headphone candy, with Eddie's snappy guitar chords resonating from ear to ear, surrounding the listener's head. His playing is pure fire on this one. For all weight, David Lee Roth was actually at a loss for lyrics. Templeman really did not care for the song. He thought it sounded like Argonne, Hold Your Head Up High. Nevertheless, Templeman decided to call in a ringer, so he reached out to Michael McDonald of Doobie Brothers fame, the undisputed king of smooth vocals. Templeman sent him a rough mix, and he whipped up lyrics in no time that were perfect for the song. Drop Dead Legs is the ultimate in Van Halen groove, starting with a semi-mellow guitar intro and a few cowbell hits, then they were off. What makes this one interesting in particular is the part at the very end where Eddie completely changes it up with a southern-inspired riff through a low-octave pedal. It turned out that that section was actually recorded entirely separately from the rest of Drop Dead Legs. They had tacked it on, and then Eddie improvised over the top with some insane chromatic passages at the end. A totally simple groove, 4/4. It is a song that's always guaranteed to get heads bopping. And the song in particular also showed how daring Eddie was when he approached a solo. Hot for Teacher took MTV by storm with its lightly rebellious lyrics. The California party band vibe was on full display for this one.
Sit down, Waldo.
Alex sounded like he was playing drums with 5 feet and 10 hands, and Eddie's signature solo is one of his most iconic. He utilized the famous symmetrical scale on a descending tap line and fit it perfectly, setting the stage for the rest of the burning solo in F-sharp minor. The most arena rock-friendly hit, Panama, featured the engine of Eddie's Lamborghini mic'd up outside the studio. The chorus is insanely simple, as is the chord progression, and they take a really cool modulation for the guitar solo. Girl Gone Bad, an idea that was born from Eddie whistling and humming into a little micro-cassette recorder while Valerie was sleeping in the other room, turned out to be probably the heaviest song on the album, and one of the heaviest they had done to date, as it's an all-out assault on the ears and a great way to close the album. The solo that Eddie played on that track in particular is from another planet. He took it far outside like a seasoned fusion player with a lot more gain and wildness. It was essentially like Eruption but with a backbeat. The album almost made it to number 1, but of course Michael Jackson's Thriller kept beating it out. And then at one point, it seemed like the popularity of Thriller was waning a little bit, opening the door for 1984, but then Michael Jackson's hair caught on fire during the recording of a Pepsi commercial, and it shot him right back up to the top. But all was not lost as Van Halen set out on the biggest tour ever. To support 1984, they had a stage set called Metropolis, and it was deemed to be the biggest production by any rock band ever. Around 175 tons of equipment and special effects were used. They actually had cranes around the stage to raise and lower the lighting. They traveled across country with 8 trucks and 5 buses and a crew of 100 people. One of the most famous things about Van Halen's tours was the inclusion of a couple weird things on their rider. The band's tours were becoming huge productions, and according to David Lee Roth, he had to make sure the contracts were read verbatim. The rigs were dangerous, and any misstep could result in somebody being hurt or killed in the band or the crew or in the audience. So he would have things like there having to be 15 amperage voltage sockets at 20-foot spaces evenly, providing 19 amperes, which doesn't even make sense. Also on the rider, M&Ms, but with the brown ones removed. Of course, M&Ms are not sold without brown ones, so that actually means that somebody would have to go through and pick them out one by one. And for good measure, they also put a large tube of KY jelly on the rider. This move goes down in history as one of the shrewdest business moves made by a band. As epic as it was by this time, there was so much infighting going on with the band. Michael Anthony got to the point that he couldn't even stand the sight of David Lee Roth, and yet here was Roth coming up to him during songs and putting his arm around him. Also, it became a battle as to who was getting the most spotlight, David or Eddie. Eddie would get a talking to if it seemed like his solos were getting a bit too long. Eddie would shoot back at David that his stage banter was taking up way too much time. At this point, Roth was already planning a solo career. He had done the Crazy from the Heat solo EP, and he'd also gotten an offer to star in his own movie. At that point, the band said screw this and recruited Sammy Hagar on vocals. The movie deal fell through for David Lee Roth, but he was well on his way to embarking on a full-fledged solo career. And that's when things got pretty ugly. It was a birth and a death at the same time. Roth-era Van Halen was no more, and the new so-called Van Hagar was about to go into full swing. Roth would pull together one of his most iconic backing bands in history, with Steve Vai, Billy Sheehan, and Greg Bissonette. A new incarnation of Van Halen would take shape, dividing old fans from new fans. And for Van Hagar, a new chapter had just begun. Stay tuned for part 3, where we dive deep into Eddie's career with the next iteration of Van Halen and beyond. Make sure to smack that like button. While you're at it, hit subscribe and join the family. I want to thank you all for watching.